really excited about that have to do with housing production. So there's a big problem in California. We are short like 3 or 3.5 million homes, and that's definitely not going to change post-pandemic. In fact, if anything, it's been an exhibit in why it's so important that we have more homes with people living in overcrowded housing and things like that. So these four bills will make it easier to build especially low-cost multifamily infill housing projects. And that's what we're going to chat about, and also how you can get involved. So we can go to the next slide. Cool. So yeah, sorry, the live is delayed. Yeah, so these three bills. Okay. So the first thing, I guess, we can talk about the legislative calendar. There's a lot that happens in Sacramento to pass a bill, so it has to get introduced. There's a deadline for introducing new legislation, and then there are various breaks. And around those breaks and between those deadlines, bills go through different committees. And then essentially, sort of like Schoolhouse Rock, they have to pass both the Assembly and the Senate. So there are 80 people in the Assembly and 40 people in the Senate. So once a bill passes both of those houses, which each of those has to go through committees to get to that stage, then Governor Newsom would sign the bill, and that's when it gets enacted into law. So the stage we're at right now is the deadline for introducing new legislation has passed. So that was about a month and a half ago. And at this point, it's mostly happening in committees. So there's a housing committee, transportation committee, finance committee. So depending on what parts of the government a bill touches, it's going to go to those different committees. And so we're sort of at the stage where if we're trying to influence the process, we're trying to make sure legislators on specific committees are in support of a bill or oppose a bill if we take a negative stance on it. And then later on, the Assembly or the Senate will vote on those bills. So there will be opportunities to influence our own Assembly members and senators at that point. So the four bills we're going to talk about today are really production bills that make it easier and more legal to build more homes. So SB 9 is the California Housing Opportunity and More Efficiency Act, or the HOME Act. This basically legalizes duplexes. SB 10 legalizes rezoning different areas so that you can cities can more easily permit more dense housing on specific parcels. The SB 478, this is the Housing Opportunity Act, and this makes it basically reduces other kinds of restrictions like lot size minimums, things that are kind of wonky but end up affecting the ability to build more dense housing. And then AP 1401, this changes the amount of parking that can be required for different different housing developments, and those end up driving up costs quite a bit. So before I turn it over to Jackson and Rebecca to talk about the specifics of those bills, just want to give a little bit of context in terms of how much land we're kind of not able to build housing on. So we basically have too much single family zoning. And if you look at this map, there's a map of where I live in Oxnard, and all this light yellow is single family only. So you cannot build anything except single family homes detached on all of these parcels. And this is like probably 85% of Oxnard. So if you own a single family home and let's say you want to add another door and a division internally so that you can have a duplex in your home, you cannot do that. That's illegal. If you want to turn it into a triplex or fourplex, you also can't do that. Only recently have you been able to build like an accessory dwelling unit. So turn your garage into another home or have something in your backyard where someone can live in a structure out there. And that's only because of state legislation passed in the past few years. But still, if you, let's say, you're moving out and your plot and also your neighbor's plot. There's some developer who wants to build a small apartment building there. That's also totally illegal. So all of this makes it really expensive to have housing because you basically at anytime you want to buy a new home, you have to buy the entire lot that that home is on, and land is expensive. So by relaxing some of these rules, allowing more diverse types of housing on these plots, we can legalize um, more affordable housing. So with that, I will turn it over to Rebecca to talk about SB 9.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for giving us some context there, Max. So the first bill that we're going to talk about is the Senate Bill 9. So I have some notes on it, and I just want to point out how beautiful the drawings are that California YIMBY provided. They're really cute. So they kind of help illustrate things that often are complex. And I know as someone who has started advocating for housing on a different level, kind of legislation is difficult to understand. So I just want to go over briefly so that we kind of have a general idea of what Senate Bill 9 is and why we are supporting Senate SB 9. So as we know, there is a lack of middle income housing and multifamily housing near jobs and transit. And this creates issues. It creates issues of displacement, of severe rent burden, and of course, we don't have enough housing. So it is currently illegal to build middle income housing in over 70% of the state, which Max kind of brought up in regards to the single family zoning in the map and how that breaks down in different cities throughout the state. And so what does SB 9 do? It allows homeowners in most areas around the state to divide their property into 2 lots. And it allows 2 homes to be built on each of those lots, which in effect legalizes fourplexes in areas that previously only allowed 1 home. So that helps, with this middle income housing multifamily housing issue that we have. So that is SB 9. It allows lots to be split and duplexes, to be built on places where previously you could only have, a single residence. Next one. That's also me. So SB 10 is another bill that we are supporting. So SB 10, so Senate Bill 10, streamlines upzoning near jobs and transit. So SB 10 makes it easier for cities to zone for smaller, lower cost housing developments of up to 10 units to address California's housing crisis. Currently, costly environmental reviews can keep cities from upzoning areas from high environment footprint, low density to more environmentally friendly, high density areas. If anyone has something to add about SB 10, please jump in because that is a lot. But otherwise, we'll go into the next one.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think something to note, like environmental reviews sound really good, and there's really a positive role for them in terms of making sure that the housing we're building is not exposing people to bad chemicals or doing things that maybe go into sprawl zones, fire zones, those kind of things, maybe flood zones. But CEQA which is the California Environmental Quality Act, which this SB 10 would allow developments to bypass. What it can sometimes be used for is really just delaying the process, blocking it for things that have nothing to do with the environment. There are bike lane proposals in San Francisco that have been blocked by CEQA lawsuits. There have been sidewalks that have been blocked by CEQA lawsuits. So it's kind of unlimited. If you want to block a homeless shelter, you can do that using CEQA. And it doesn't have to, it can be about kind of made up claims about wind or shadows or something like that. So all of this ends up costing cities time, years sometimes to go through these environmental reviews. And then they have to hire all these consultants to actually administer the reviews. That can cost thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions of dollars for these bigger developments. And it's pretty clear that if you're transforming a single family home lot into something that's can have 10 homes or 4 homes or something like that, that's going to benefit the environment. It's going to make people um, it's going to help them live closer to their jobs so they don't have to drive as much, maybe live closer to services. Um, and also because that development, there are going to be fewer exterior walls. That's less in heating and air conditioning that you have to use, which is a major source of carbon emissions and other kinds of pollutants. So this seems like a really good kind of nitty gritty way to actually let cities do what we want them to do, which is legalize more dense housing.
Thank you.
All right, so now I will go over 2 other bills that are intended to boost housing production. I'll start with Senate Bill 478, which is intended to remove barriers to affordable housing that are caused by floor area ratios and minimum lot sizes. I'll briefly go over those concepts. So generally, for residential properties, minimum lot sizes are a means used to control where development um, is allowed on a lot. So let's say you buy a lot in the residential area that's maybe half an acre. There are certain parts of the lot you aren't going to be able to build on, and the development code will tell you where you can and cannot build. Um, Minimum lot sizes are one way of um, approaching that, where it'll say you have to have a lot of this size to be in conformance with the code, and then you also, I'll go through the examples in a moment, but you also may be restricted by a certain amount of housing per lot size. So you basically can only have a house for each 6,000 square feet of a lot or whatever that you have. And then floor area ratios generally apply to commercial developments, but they are also important for housing purposes because they can apply to mixed use developments that have a commercial component. And so you'll see this is kind of an extreme example, but in Marin County, they have applied floor area ratios to like a duplex where you have a 2-story building. Basically, if you were to build a 1-story building and cover an entire lot, that would be a floor area ratio of 1.0. If you were to cut that in half and only build on half of the lot at 1 story, that's a 0.5 floor area ratio. If you were to cut the building in half and build a 2-story building in that same half of the property, same footprint, that takes you back to a 1.0. So it's basically the ratio of the amount of land that you have to the amount of floor space you have in the building. So you take the footprint of the building and multiply it by the number of floor plates you have. So this also limits the ability of people to develop the property. So a lot of times you'll see huge properties or even moderate sized properties where there's a building only in like a certain corner of it, and that's a lot of the time because of the floor area ratio and because of the parking requirements related to the uses in that building. So this is intended to ease those restrictions and make it easier to build a greater quantity of housing and build in a way that's not so inhumane. If you'll notice, older cities, European cities, they tend to build wall to wall in a way that creates a continuous built environment along the street. So if you're walking past it, you don't see all these gaps for parking. You don't see all these spaces between buildings so much. In the US, especially in Southern California, we don't do it that way. And we tend to just, through regulation, make a lot of the space not developable. And that has severe implications for how much housing we can provide in that space. If you can only use 30% of your lot to build housing, even though you've got, you know, you've got a decent sized lot, you're not going to be able to actually produce that much housing with it. So that's SB 478. Here are some examples from our local zoning codes. Start with Ventura County. You can see that there's minimum lot area here in the first column, determining what what the minimum lot size is for a property in each zone to be able to develop it. You can also see over on the right side, there are things like maximum structure height that are used to limit the vertical use of that property. Um, so that basically gives you a box in which you can operate to build your building, which limits the amounts of units that you can produce without going smaller. And then there are unit size requirements as well. Here's City of San Buenaventura. It's kind of the same thing. You see a minimum lot area and a minimum lot width, and this means there are only certain shapes of lot sizes that are possible. And if you add certain restrictions, like it's not visible here, but here you see in Ventura County the minimum required setbacks. Um, if you go, you basically say you have a 100-foot wide property and you can use the portion of it that's not within the setbacks, and it's say 10 feet on either side. So you've now got 80 feet of usable space within that 100-foot wide property, and then there'll be setbacks in the front and back sometimes too. So really, it's a way of regulating where and how you can build in that space. Then I'll go. Ventura also has, along with its minimum. Sorry if I'm jumping around too much, Cassandra, but it's hopefully it's coming across. Ventura City has, in addition to minimum lot sizes, minimum lot area for each dwelling unit. So you can see in the R1 zone, which is going to be one of the most common zones for single family housing, uh, you need a 6,000 square foot lot to be able to develop a house. So if you have a 11,500 square foot lot and you wanted to split it in two and build two houses, you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to have one house and slightly under the required lot size to build another house. Next, I will move on to Assembly Bill 1401,
Sorry,
which,
can I just jump in there with one example, just
oh
because
yeah,
I just
go ahead.
learned this a couple days ago. There's a city in the Bay Area. So, Ventura, this is kind of extreme, right? 6,000 square foot lots. Like, that's pretty big. There is a city in the Bay Area named Los Altos Hills where the minimum lot size is 1 acre. That's like 43,000 square feet. Um, and for bigger, basically depending on the slope of the lot, it's kind of this like hilly area. The minimum lot size can go up to 7 acres. So this is just an extreme amount of land that they are forcing every resident to purchase. And the result of that is exclusion of low and middle income families. The median home value there is, not surprisingly, like $4.5 million. So they don't allow any apartments there. So I think this it would help places like where we are in Ventura County, but it would really help people who want to live in these more completely exclusionary communities like Los Altos Hills. And that ultimately helps the entire state because the housing shortage, when people can't get to live in Los Altos Hills, that makes it more expensive for every other city in the Bay Area. And the same thing here in Southern California. We're all part of the same region. We're all affected by if certain LA communities don't do their part. There's more that Ventura County can do, but all of these things really affect the bigger picture as well.
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up, Max. And it's if we had an infinite amount of land to use, none of these restrictions would really matter because people could just buy land somewhere else and build and have their own space, but we don't. And even though California is this huge state, and even though it seems overcrowded a lot of the time, we're really not. We could handle tens of millions more people, maybe more. We just have to deal with the water and other local issues. But space-wise, we have plenty of space. The reality is a lot of it is covered by restrictions, either in the form of these zoning code requirements or in terms of being protected land environmentally or protected. So in Ventura County, I know in Napa and I believe Sonoma counties too, there's this thing called SOAR, which is a great way of saving open space and saving agriculture, but it also means that a lot of the land that otherwise would have been developed is now not really developable for any kind of intense housing needs. So basically, by doing something like that, you shift the burden of there being new housing construction to the existing communities and to any land where there isn't a restriction at this point. And California has been very good at restricting land and not good at using the land it has that is unrestricted to produce more housing. So that's part of why we've been in this crisis for quite some time and will be in it for the foreseeable future. So here's another issue that goes along with that, which is parking. Um, you don't think of parking taking up a lot of space, but in reality, it actually does. Um, because of parking requirements and because there's this perceived need from the public that any new development is going to require a lot of parking. Otherwise, people are going to be crowding their own streets and making life inconvenient for them. There's a tendency to require new development to bring in a lot of new parking to accommodate the people that are going to live there. And what that does is it drives up the development cost of new housing and makes it harder to build affordable housing. It also squanders the land that is available locally for more housing and for other needs that might make driving less necessary. Assembly Bill 1401 is going to reduce the barriers that these parking mandates cause. So if a home commercial building is near transit or in a neighborhood that has a low rate of car use, it's going to reduce the amount of parking that's required to be provided. I believe within certain distance of transit, it's also not going to be a requirement at all. So you think about a parking space, it's going to be generally like a 9 foot by 18 foot or 10 foot by 18 foot space of asphalt. And that just doesn't seem very impressive, very notable. But to develop a parking space like that, you know, basically pour the asphalt, mark the lines, maintain it, it ends up adding up cost wise. So something like that, um, and this was in 2014 numbers, so it's even higher now, could cost up to around $20,000 per surface space for that. And surface parking is the cheapest to develop, which is why we see so much of it everywhere. If you're going to make more efficient use of the space and create vertical parking structures, that's going to increase the cost of each space to develop. So you're now looking at around like $50,000 or more per space in a structure that's meant to have probably hundreds of parking spaces. And if you want to hide the parking completely or make better use of the vertical element of the land that you have, um, and do an underground parking structure, that's going to increase the cost even more. So you're going to have like, an $80,000 expense per that, 9 or 10 foot by 15 or by 18 foot parking space. And so even though it's hard to see the cost of parking when you're looking around in your community, all of these spaces devoted to parking that have to be developed, all the structures to try and use it more wisely, have these huge financial implications for new housing development when they're required. So reducing that burden um, is essential to reducing the cost of producing housing in California. And my apologies to Dr. Shoup and Dr. Wilson if I have spoken on anything. I expect to hear about it, but there is definitely a need to look at how we use parking and stop seeing it as this free provision for housing within the state of California, in order to make our society run better and our costs, reduce our costs from what they have been. So with that,
Can I
I'll turn
just
it
like
back over to Matt.
emphasize this? I mean, because this is like per space. There
Yeah.
are a lot of developments that require one or more parking spaces per bedroom, right? So if
Yeah.
you're a young family, maybe you have 2 kids, you have a 3 bedroom home, you're being forced in a dense area where basically the most cost effective way to provide that parking. If you're trying to buy a condo, a 3 bedroom condo, you could be forced to pay over $200,000 potentially more than you would have to pay for that home if there were no parking requirement. So that's just an insane, I mean, it's an amazing subsidy for car makers, right? I mean, and fossil fuel companies who benefit from all the gas that you have to fill up your car from. But for people who just want a place to live without, especially if it's in a walkable community, or if they prefer the bike, or they want transit, or if they just work from home and don't need 3 cars for their 3 bedroom home, it's really not a good deal.
Right. And when you consider, okay, so if everyone has this concept that I'm going to drive my car everywhere and I want a space to park it and I want everyone else to have the same thing because I don't want them crowding into my parking space or making my commute more difficult, um, then everyone's going to kind of push for more parking. But if you get out of that mentality and you start thinking about, well, where can I bike to? Where can I walk to do my daily errands? Or can I take transit to work? Um, though that's not possible in a lot of places, or it's not as convenient as a car yet, the reality is that kind of mode shift is necessary from a public health perspective and also from a community health perspective because it just costs, this parking development cost is just one little piece of the larger community budget pie where there's this huge amount of unseen expenses that goes into maintaining our suburban way of life that's built around the car. And if we don't address that, our communities eventually become uh, financially unsustainable. Um, so if we start looking at ways we can replace the requirement of having a car and the requirement of having parking to serve those cars with um, other means of transport, and we start using that space that would have been parking more wisely, we can really shift how our community functions, and in a lot of ways that'll provide a lot of space for housing people that are currently unable to afford housing or have been pushed out of this market by the high cost of the housing that required developed parking and required all these other costs to be added in. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Max.
Yeah, and actually, we can see on that chart real quick because I'll talk about this. Um, yeah, the study that came out of San Francisco, which I think addresses some of the concerns people often have around parking, which is if you take away the parking before the other kinds of transportation options are made available, it's not going to work. Like people are still going to own cars. People basically, they're not elastic. If they require a car, they're going to have a car no matter how much parking is required. It's just they're going to maybe park in a parking lot or on the street, or if they don't have the option within their home. And this study kind of turns that or disputes that notion. So what they did was they looked at a program which randomly allocated, people to different affordable housing units. And basically, the type of unit in terms of how much parking was on site was it varied quite a bit depending on which home they were assigned to. So they found that the people who had no parking on site were about half as likely, if I'm looking at this right, yeah, about half as likely as people who were assigned to homes with at least one parking space required in the unit. So this does actually show that people's car ownership does change depending on how much parking is provided. So people, when they're not forced to pay effectively for parking, they do find other kinds of transportation options. And that means that things like this are actually going to reduce car usage It's going to really promote the other kinds of transportation that we really want: transit, bike lanes, sidewalks, walking. And so this is kind of unnecessary requirement that is pushing people into transportation options that are not always ideal for them. So yeah, we can definitely promote more transit and more other kinds of transportation options too. But it shouldn't be, I don't think, a blocker for also removing these parking requirements. And with that, I think, first of all, I'll ask if, Rebecca, Cassandra, Jackson, if you have anything else on the policy side before we get into our requests for people. But
just that there are other bills as well that CA YIMBY is supporting. So I encourage everyone to go to cayimby.org and check out their legislation section and see what they say about those bills. Getting housing bills through California legislature is a challenge, as we've seen the last few years, and hopefully this time around it'll work out that we actually get some traction and get some housing production going, because ultimately we need it. It needs to be the right match for the people that are in need of housing, but we can't just expect no housing to be produced and somehow the homelessness and the housing affordability issues to just go away magically. They're not going to. And there's no ethical solution for those problems that involves, not creating more housing. So let's hope it actually works out this time.
Absolutely. And there's different levels at which we can, like advocate for housing. You don't have to be an expert. I'm learning also as you guys are learning. And just like Jackson said, there's other bills on the California YIMBY website. They have a great website set up where you can get like a one sheet of information on what the bill is, and you can look at the graphic that better explains it. I know I pointed out how beautiful the drawings are, and those help me because I'm on Twitter, and so like I see, I'm like, oh, okay, that's what it is. So and I just better understand that bill. Because it's something that I want to support, but I also want to have at least some understanding of what it is that I am supporting. And, just like Jackson said, we can't expect that, that these issues are going to be resolved without advocating for them, especially when there's a lot of pressure for communities to stay zoned only for single families. I like to speak on the issue of exclusion for many families, because it's important. It's important when we are looking at how housing has had a history of excluding certain communities of color. And these are small but very impactful ways that we can help advocate for them as we're learning on how to be, housing advocates, and looking at our own communities and seeing like, okay, what can we do different, and how will that help? How will those bills? How will the level of activism that I'm doing? How will that help my community? And that's really important. And I think, that the bills help advance that. So definitely checking out the website to be able to do that. So that we can take those steps forward and not leave it up to sometimes people who, sit on city council or planning commission that really don't understand, or just don't have the tools to, solve all the issues. I remember going to a planning commission where they had to, take a vote, where they all basically said that they had to vote yes, because their hands were tied, because they were cornered into approving a project in Simi Valley, and that particular development had a lot of affordable housing units, and a lot of community members really supported, that development. But to hear that, is really it's really difficult, to say that like we have to say yes. There's no option because we're going to get sued by the state. Like, things like that are really difficult when we're talking about housing people. Creating housing that many people need, and housing that people who are highly impacted also need. So it's definitely, advocating at that higher level, that state level, showing support really does help us take that power away from them, or not force them into making those decisions that they frankly don't want to make. And so I think it's a good way for us to learn how to advocate at that slightly higher level.
Yeah, and I'd add, I mean, what it really is about is, should cities have the authority to block affordable housing, to keep low income people out of their communities? Right now, they have basically unlimited authority to do that. That's been curtailed a bit by some of the state legislation, like what Rebecca mentioned, SB 828, for example, basically actually sets some more strict requirements on cities to zone for growth. And SB 35 takes away some of their power to reject low-income housing developments. That's been used in Simi Valley. All the ADU legislation allows people to build these backyard granny flats and things like that. But it's kind of like, what should the default position be? Should it be that unlimited authority to block housing? Some neighbor wants to house some low-income people on their property, and cities should be able to do that. I think the default position is you should be able to do with what you want with your property, and to the extent that local governments are preventing people from doing good things with it, that's a really positive role that the state can play. And also, I know Cassandra's going to talk more about this, but our legislators are totally swing votes. So your voice really matters on this. For example, SB 9 is basically the same bill as SB 1120 from last year. That's the bill that legalizes duplexes. That was basically, so Monique Limon, Jackie Irwin, and Henry Stern all abstained from that bill. If they had voted yes for that bill, it actually did it's a very weird story. It did pass the Assembly and it passed the Senate, but not quite in time to meet the midnight deadline for it to get enacted into law. But if they had voted yes on that, there's a pretty good chance that duplexes would already be legal on any lot in California. So, I think it's really too bad that we're going to have to maybe wait another year. That's a year of people experiencing more high housing costs, of people not being able to move into these more exclusionary communities that don't allow duplexes. But no time like the present, right? I mean, if it didn't happen in the past, we can still change the law. And all those people are in the Senate and Assembly today. They can be moved. If they get enough calls from people like you, they're going to listen to that. So, yeah.
All right. So how you can help? Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. So how you can help? So like Max said, our legislators are swing votes. So tell them that you want more homes. Definitely make your voice heard. If you have some issues in regards or some concerns regarding making public comments, I do know that YIMBY Action is hosting a workshop on the 17th, I believe. So definitely, if you need some assistance with making public comments, there's that, which is going to be a great resource for that. Join Ventura County YIMBY. Get involved. We do have monthly meetings. The next one is going to be Saturday, April 10th. Join us, see what everything's about, come talk about housing and, everything else that we've got going on here. And then spread the word, spread the word about YIMBY. Anyone that that might be interested in housing, invite them to a meeting, invite them to visit our website, to view our Facebook page or our Facebook group, to reach out to us, DM us with any questions in regards to housing or any of these bills. We're definitely open to provide you with whatever insight we're able to in regards to the bills that we have up and coming up in other housing things within the county. But that is about it. Any other last words?
Thank you all for joining us on Easter.
Yeah, thank you. We appreciate anyone who's willing to sit through our discussions and learn more about housing and housing issues in California. So thank you for being with us.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes, and this video will be saved, so definitely share it and let's get the word out. Have a great day, everyone.